So we're building a world and we don't really understand what it is that we're building. But as Dana Boyd told us earlier, whatever it is that we're building, it's not neutral. And as geeks, I suspect that we don't think about that as much as what we should, or sometimes even think about that at all. But artists and novelists, they can tell us about that. They can give us insights into what it is that we're building that we otherwise can't get. And we forget the power of the artist, the novelist, the writer at our peril. Lauren Beukes is a wonderful South African novelist who's taking our world and our near future world and showing us ways that it could be. She's the current Arthur C. Clarke Prize winner. She's come all the way from South Africa, and I'm freaking delighted that she's come to Webstock. Please give her a huge welcome.
Thank you. So, as a writer, I'm very lucky in that I get paid to make stuff up about all the things that I'm interested in, and hopefully I can get Keynote to work. These are some of the things that I am interested in. I'm interested in magical animal familiars as a symbol for guilt and redemption. I'm interested in the shiny, happy facade of our very disturbed society. I'm interested in really cute dragons. I'm interested in kid superheroes out to save the world. I'm interested in scathing political satire, with or without puppets. I'm interested in crazy ARGs about haptic holograms who've got out of control, possessed by the whole of the internet, and lolcats especially. I'm interested in female beauty impersonation pageants. This was a documentary I directed. I'm interested in Tokyo fairy tales. I'm interested in poverty being co-opted by rich people and exploited. And I'm interested in scary things with teeth. So what I'm most interested in, above and beyond all of that, is the real world. And that's why the title of this talk is Kinking Reality. I don't know if anyone saw this quote on Twitter earlier today. I was promised a future of cyborg cops and killer robot spiders, but all I got were faux vintage photos of cupcakes on an online pinboard. Okay, it's true, but I also think that the world is crazier and weirder than anyone could have imagined. Not this guy, Nostradamus. Not this guy, that's actually Bruce Sterling, not Jeremy Keith. Though they might be separated by birth. Not this guy, William Gibson, and not the Mayans either. But as much as we don't have spider robots and cyborg cops or teleporters, which would have been really handy so I didn't have to fly for 2 days to get here, we do have a lot of really weird stuff in the world right now, and I think it's weirder than anyone could have possibly imagined. We've got genetically modified animals, we've got cyborg implants for the disabled, we've got drone wars, Jeremy Keith was mentioning earlier bots, which were just terrifying. And we have the uncanny valley. If that's not terrifying, I don't know what is. But the problem with this weird, amazing world is that we take it for granted. It's become banal. It might not be a Metropolis or Matrix scenario where we're enslaved to the machines, but we are enslaved to our iPhones. And we're enslaved to this information overload. And we kind of skip over the surface of things, and I think that's a problem in this crazy, very, very busy world. And I think that's where story comes in, and I think that's why story is so very, very important. And if you look at the power of story through the ages, you know, there was that Jesus guy with his parables. There was Aesop with his fables. We've known about the power of storytelling for a very long time. It's how we understand the world. There was a very interesting series of studies recently which came out of the University of Toronto's Cognitive Science Division. And what they were looking at is that fiction is modeling. It's actually a simulation that our brains can run, which helps us to understand the world and who we are in it. And through the series of studies, and you can look it up online, they showed that people who read fiction are probably able to empathize more and have a better connection to things that are bigger than us. If you're reading nonfiction, sure, you can kind of understand the story, and I think what the world needs is more kind of very insightful narrative journalism. But fiction actually puts you right in there. It runs a model to understand other people's emotions and society and our place in it. And I think we need more of that kind of thing. Does anybody know what this is? Okay, it's not a glazed turd, I promise. It's actually a South African delicacy. It's a traditional dessert called a koeksister. And it looks very fancy, and I also found the most fancy photograph that I could of it. But it's basically just a donut that's been twisted, but it's immediately more interesting because of that. And that's the kind of metaphor that I like to use with my fiction. I like to twist things like a koeksister. And you can see some very, very interesting examples. I'm going to talk about some other people's work for a bit, and then I'll come back to my own. So you take inspiration from reality, real-life African dictators. Inspires the work of Kudzanai Chiurai, who's an amazing Zimbabwean artist who just had a major exhibition in Johannesburg. Poor white people in South Africa, terrible photographs. And this inspires the Antwoord. The photographs were taken by Roger Ballin. Roger Ballin has just interviewed their new, he's just filmed their new video. What's interesting about the Antwoord is how they've co-opted this into this very kind of high-concept supergroup, much like Lady Gaga or Marilyn Manson, but that is not their reality. They've used it to make kind of interesting statements and strange music. Peter Hugo's photographs. Have you guys seen this photograph? Beautiful. It's absolutely amazing. It's this Nigerian group of kind of carnival guys, but they're also debt collectors. And the way they keep the hyenas tame is they feed them hash when they're puppies, when they're cubs. They steal them out of the den, feed them hash, keep them stoned, do little performing circus tricks, but then they also, if you borrow money from them, they will come into your house with a hyena and be like, okay, better time to pay up. And I don't know about you guys, but that would freak me out. Unfortunately, this is the least interesting example of how the reality has been used in fiction. The Beyoncé music video. Yeah. So this brings me to my favorite example. And I think what's interesting about all of these examples is how amazing Africa is. And I mentioned this in my speech at the, when I won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, that to me, South Africa is science fiction. It's that mashup of first world and third world. It's magic and technology happening together. I think we have some of the most inspiring and interesting things in the world happening right now in South Africa. So to come back to my favorite example of reality-inspiring fiction, you guys all know this? Apparently there was some small Wellington business that was involved with this somehow. And they wouldn't lend me a pronoun. Actually, they didn't have one. I did ask them, but they didn't have a pronoun. I was going to wave one around. Now, what's most interesting about this movie, it was originally based on a short which Neil Blomkamp made. I had nothing to do with this, by the way. Neil Blomkamp made a very powerful short called Alive in Joburg. And I wanted to show it to you, but I didn't manage to edit it together properly. So please look it up online. But it's actually more potent and bleaker than District 9. It's based on a lot of real footage, including vox pops from real people about the aliens. And I'll get to that in a minute. Well, yeah. So basically, he gets vox pops from people on the street talking about how, the aliens, they're going to come here and they're going to rape and murder people. It's just terrible. They're stealing our jobs. They're stealing our women. They're stealing our electricity. And what was so amazing about Alive in Joburg, the original clip which became District 9, was that he was interviewing real people, and the aliens that they were talking about were foreign Africans. So refugees. So basically, if you have District 9, it is amazing because it's this marriage of scathing social satire and super fun action movie. And if you just had the one without the other, it wouldn't work. If you just had the story about refugees, it would be Hotel Rwanda. Wonderful film, I don't know if anyone's seen it. Critically acclaimed, didn't do anywhere near the box office of District 9. For a story about a hardcore genocide, it's fun, I suppose. And if you just had a story about aliens with issues, you would have had Battlefield Earth. Anyone see this? I'm so sorry. Oof. So you put the two together and you have something really amazing. On their own, Hotel Rwanda is an excellent film. This is not. But, it's the power of the marriage of the two concepts, to take that reality and twist it in a really interesting way, to distort it. This is...
24 people are dead and 10,000 are seeking
refuge. Let me just pause this. While District 9 was filming in 2008, Neil Blomkamp was obviously very aware of these issues because that's what he based Alive in Joburg on. But while they were filming in 2008, or I think maybe just before, this happened in South Africa.
24 people are dead and 10,000 are seeking refuge as xenophobic violence in South Africa continues for the 5th day. The majority of the victims have been immigrants from Zimbabwe and elsewhere in Africa living in squatter camps. Foreigners are an easy target because they are seen as competing for scarce resources. South Africans are struggling to buy food as prices rise amid stubbornly high unemployment. The South African Red Cross and other aid groups appeal for funds to take care of the hundreds of people who have been displaced. Some victims were set alight.
Surely we came here for safety reasons, but otherwise the people think otherwise.
Okay, so I don't know what's easier to watch. Well, I do know what's easier to watch. I'd much rather watch District 9 than that real-life news footage because it's harrowing, it's horrible. It's very hard to see that kind of thing, and we're inundated with these kind of things all the time. You know, the murders that are happening in Syria at the moment, Athens protests, genocide, rape in the DRC Congo. It's too much, it's overwhelming. And what we run up against is issue fatigue and desensitization. And that's where I think fiction works even better because it actually allows us to slip past the issue fatigue. And I think that's really interesting. And to get at kind of big ideas and big issues using a strange high concept. I'm going to run through a couple of examples. Blade Runner, what it means to be human. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, what it means when women are treated as less than human. William Gibson's Pattern Recognition, how to be human in a branded, co-opted world. China Miéville's The City in the City, how human society is split into parallel experiences that sometimes intersect, but they're really determined by kind of poverty and privilege. This kind of filmmaking is inhuman. Okay, so now I'm going to get on to some of my own work and what I'm inspired by. Moxieland was my first novel. I didn't set out to write science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction, but I didn't, sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write a science fiction novel. I wrote about the stuff which made me angry and upset and the stuff that I saw happening around me. To the extent that when my editor said to me, listen, you've really got to put a date on this, I didn't want to. Because as far as I was concerned, this stuff was happening right now. It's about a corporate apartheid state, it's about cell phones used for social control, it's about governments that can shut down your internet without any warning. I mean, how likely is that stuff? So eventually I had to put a date on it, it was 2018. But I think what was interesting for me was to really kind of explore these issues, and I intended it to be, obviously it's not a soapbox, I'm not giving you a lecture, it has to be a story first, it has to be captivating and it has to kind of draw you in, and I hope I achieved that. But the point of it is also to talk about the stuff which makes me angry. There's that great maxim about those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, I've got an addition to that, which is that those who cannot imagine the future are doomed to fuck it up. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with Moxieland. I'm just going to run through a quick aside. Sometimes you want to be able to bring reality into the real world as well, or bring your twisted reality of fiction into the real world. And we did that a little bit with the Moxieland launch. It wasn't quite an ARG, but we tried to bring the experience of what this kind of world where corporates and non-corporates were segregated into kind of the experience. So I had protesters outside with flyers protesting the bioengineered police dogs. Unfortunately, South Africans are so used to protesters, I think they just ignored them. I had a doorkeeper with a clipboard, and she would assign you randomly, you didn't know that, but you would pretend that she had a list, to be corporate or non-corporate. If you were corporate, you got to go to the lovely entrance with the lovely ladies who would sweep you inside and offer you drinks and be very welcoming. If you were assigned to the non-corporate entrance, you kind of had to go down the side to an alleyway, and this guy harassed them for like 10 minutes. Eventually, I had to go to him and say, look, can you actually let them in, please? Including Andre Brink, who is my supervisor in my MA in creative writing, and he's one of South Africa's major novel talents, and he was just standing outside arguing with this guy for 10 minutes. It was a great way to get into the experience. We had some documentation. One of the things in the book is that you can get sponsored by a corporation if you're an artist, and I actually had some people fill in the apply to be sponsored form. You also got a test tube as you came in the door, and you were told that you might be infected. And you had to go downstairs and have it tested. It was a little tiny bit of caustic soda in half the test tubes. And if you were infected, it would turn pink, and you would have to get the antidote, which was a squirt of apple sours. So, you know, it was a fun way of trying to bring in some of that experience and recreate it and introduce people to the book when they didn't know anything about it. My next book, Zoo City, this is one which won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and arguably some people say it's not science fiction because it's got a lot of magic in it. It's set in a contemporary Joburg, and it's about that South African obsession. I don't know if any of you have South African friends, but the only thing South Africans really seem to be able to talk about is crime. So it's a book about crime. And there's an amazing thing happening in the South African crime fiction scene at the moment. It's really exploding. Some of the names you might want to look out for include Margie Orford, Dion Meyer is fantastic, and Mike Nichol. And Mike Nichol has this great thing about how he's very jealous of kind of the Scandinavian crime writers. Not just because they're so successful and their books are doing so well, but because nothing much happens in Scandinavian countries. You know, you can make up an outrageous crime. Whereas in South Africa, crime writers are having to compete with the real headlines all the time, and they're crazier. I'm going to show you some examples. These were 2 headlines which came up just before I left South Africa. I know zombies are so done in the rest of the world. South Africa, we've still got them going on. Maskandi, which is kind of a folk singer, back from the dead. Thousands of people came to see him. It turned out ultimately to be an imposter and a fraudster, but, you know, this was par for the course and lots of people bought into it. Another one, mermaids prevent government officials from installing water pumps in dams. Now, I believe there's a strip club down the road called Mermaids. Not these guys, actual mermaids. This is from a Zimbabwean paper. So reality is often, you know, and we've had other stories about there's a lot of gangsterism and crime in the nightclub industry. There's a big kind of, the bouncers have private security firms and lots of intrigue, very Sopranos, it's fantastic. Brett Keble, a mining magnate and art patron a couple of years ago, organized his own hit. He organized hitmen to come and kill him. So really crazy stuff happens in South Africa. One example that I used in Zoo City was if you have tuberculosis, you can get a government grant. So there are these dodgy hustlers who go to people who have TB, and they say, listen, can you cough into this jar for me? And they cough up a nice big fat lung full of phlegmy sputum, and they go and sell that to someone else so that they can claim a government grant. You can't make this stuff up. I also included some tabloid headlines just for fun. Flesh-eating maggots, bushes of evil, and one of my favorite. I did not Photoshop that. So the point is that reality is often way weirder than fiction. I was interested in crime, I was interested in redemption. That's a very South African conceit as well. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to try and get over the wrongs which happened during apartheid. And I was very interested in kind of people trying to overcome the past. And of course, apartheid is the past that we live with and have to overcome as well. So I knew that I had this idea of a girl with a sloth on her back. And I knew that it was a burden, but also the possibility of redemption. And I knew that she lived in Hillbrow, which is kind of the inner city slums. And I grew up in Johannesburg, but I wanted to go back on kind of a location scout. My daughter was 3 months old, and I flew off to Joburg. And I hired a fixer, who is kind of a security guard / translator / facilitator. And we walked around Hillbrow for several days. Hillbrow is very interesting because it used to be the glamour capital of Johannesburg. It's where all the restaurants and bars and nightclubs were. And then it slipped a little bit and it became quite bohemian. Became big gay scene, big mixed race scene, much to the apartheid government's infuriation. Lots of drugs going around. And then it slipped a bit more and it just kept degenerating. And now it's kind of on the up again. But there are a lot of abandoned buildings in Hillbrow. I don't know if you've seen the movie Jerusalem, which is all about people kind of hijacking abandoned buildings. Squatters. Louis Theroux did a special on Hillbrow where he went running in his bulletproof vest. And it's known for, during New Year's Eve, people throw refrigerators and television sets off their balconies. They get very, very drunk and just kind of, the paramedics are having to duck fridges. But what you forget is it's also some place that people live. And if I was just reading books or watching documentaries, I would have had a completely different sense of it than I did walking the streets. And it's still hectic. There's lots of rubbish and, you know, not really dangerous. No, I think more so at night. But I certainly also had my fixer Johnson with me the whole time. These are some flyers offering cheap abortions. They're prophets who will sort out all your problems, penis enlargements, basically whatever you need. I spotted this building from the street, and I said to my fixer, I said, we've got to go there. That building is amazing. And this was actually the premier kind of apartment block. This was the place to live in Joburg in the 70s. And we went and spoke to security, and they said, fine, we can go up. And the elevator was out, which meant that we had to climb like 24 stories up the stairs. And what this meant for the residents was that they weren't able to carry their garbage down. So they would chuck it down, and by arrangement with the management, and then they would kind of clear it up. But these are the circumstances that people were living with. And of course, I totally put all of this in the book, because it was great. It's a view from the top. This is the young security team who patrol the building. And what's very interesting in Hillbrow is that you have these individuals who, their entire mandate, the cops don't really come into Hillbrow so much, but the private security companies run buildings, but they'll only patrol that building. So if something happens across the road, nothing to do with them. So these two guys patrolled this building, and they told me some crazy stories. They once caught a rapist just by waiting outside the door with the rape victim until he came out of the apartment, and then they nabbed him, which I also put in the book. I decided in the book that I wanted to have a scene where my heroine Zinzi has to go and see a sangoma, or a traditional healer. So I went to Mai Mai, which is the traditional market where they have a lot of healers. And it was very atmospheric and creepy, lots of kind of animal bones and woven baskets, leopard skins, baboon skulls. And I paid for a consultation with a sangoma. This is off Flickr, it's not actually the woman I saw. And I was with my friend Lindiwe Nkuta, and she is Zulu, but she didn't want to come in with me. She said, no ways, I'm not going to mess with that stuff. So I was like, okay, fine. And I went in and I saw the sangoma, but she only spoke Zulu. And I only speak English and Afrikaans because I grew up under apartheid and we just didn't learn Nguni languages. So the sangoma brought in a translator to help. And she made me throw the bones, which is a collection of objects from a domino to shells, bones, a little plastic troll from a McDonald's meal. So you throw that out, and then she reads the constellation of those objects and determines your kind of destiny. So she's reading, these constellations, and she's looking at things, and she's talking to herself, and she goes off for about 5 minutes in Zulu. And I'm like, okay, what did she say? And the translator turns to me, and she's like, you have woman problems. And I was like, yeah, and? She's like, no, that's all she said. So the final diagnosis after about 20 minutes was that I had a dark shadow over me, and I had to sacrifice a black chicken to come out of this. And I like eating chicken, but sacrificing them not so much. So I didn't feel I needed to go that far for the novel. But I did build a lot of that scene, and I also remixed it to make it work for fiction. The other thing I did was Zinzi goes into the storm drains. So I went into the storm drains. And what was interesting was that I went on a special guided tour in Cape Town, actually. There was detail there that I couldn't have imagined. And I was a journalist for a very long time, and that's one of the best things that I learned about journalism, is that you will find details which you just absolutely never would have imagined. And the detail I wouldn't have imagined in the storm drains was cockroaches. But not, like they were scuttering around. But the worst was that they would kind of congeal in damp spots on the wall. So you'd have this kind of cluster of pale cockroaches sipping at the water. And the guy in front of me on the tour was walking along, and the footing was very uneven, and he tripped. And he squashed, crunch, like smear of like 10 cockroaches under his hand. It was revolting. And then, I decided I needed a murder scene in the book, so I went out and... No, I'm kidding. But reality nearly derailed my novel. Reality is a bit like, it can be like dynamite. You've got to handle it with care when you're using it in fiction, because otherwise it might blow your full head off, which is what happened to me. So I was also very shaken by the xenophobic attacks in 2008. I was writing the novel in 2009. The Central Methodist Church in inner city Johannesburg was very well known during the 80s for harboring anti-apartheid activists. It was a place of shelter. And when the xenophobic attacks happened in 2008, where people were just being killed in the streets, 6,000 Zimbabweans, Congolese, Angolans, Nigerians, all kind of crammed into the Central Methodist Church. And I'd seen photographs, and I knew that I wanted to set a major part of the novel there. So I phoned up the Bishop Paul Verlaine, and I arranged a visit during a Sunday night service. And I went with Johnson, my fixer. And what's interesting about Johnson is that he is a Zimbabwean refugee himself. He's been living in Johannesburg for about 10 years now with his family in a community of other expat refugees. So we go there, and my friends who are dropping me off almost don't let me out of the car because these aren't my photos, there's this surge of people outside, and there's a very ugly feeling. It feels like a riot about to break out. And no one's kind of making eye contact, and Johnson and I kind of had to push through the crowd to get to the church. And we get there and we go up, and there's no sign of the bishop, so we just kind of sit down and we watch the service. And again, a detail I wouldn't have known about, unless I was actually there. I was sitting next to a Zimbabwean nurse, and amidst all these crazy people, and it was harrowing. There were sick people coughing, there was this kind of sickly sweet smell in the air. There was a guy kind of sprawled out, and his feet were kind of festering. People coughing, babies crying, just generally people with their hands, hid in their hands. This real sense of despair. And here was this woman sitting next to me, immaculately dressed, head to toe in a white dress. Kind of a linen white dress with beautiful embroidery work on it. So she was a nurse, and she said to me afterwards, she said, "Why don't you come see where I'm sleeping?" So I said, "I'd love to do that." So we went, she took me after the service, and we went through a doorway and into this pitch black stairwell, and you couldn't move. You were just shoving past people. And there was, again, such a sense of aggression and anger. You couldn't see a thing. You got to the bottom, there were kind of rattan plastic suitcases stacked up of all people's possessions in the world. You had to step over people who were trying to find a space to sleep, maybe if they were lucky with a piece of cardboard, on narrow staircases, narrow step this wide. So you kind of had to step over them, and eventually you came out into a room, probably about a third of the size of this one. It was standing room only. It was the women's quarters. There wasn't space. There wasn't space to stand. There were, again, plastic suitcases. There were babies being bathed in buckets. And a lot of those babies were the result of rape at the border. And this woman showed me, this is where I sleep, and I couldn't understand. There was no space to stand, let alone lie down. And it was a very harrowing experience. And one of the things that I realized during this is that dehumanizing is not just something that other people do to you. The Hutu called the Tutsis cockroaches or Nyenzi, and that's how they slaughtered them in Rwanda. I might dehumanize you by saying, "Oh, glasses guy, I'm going to kill all guys with glasses." But it's also something you internalize, and it was something these people had internalized. They kind of let go of something. They just it was a self-defense mechanism. They'd shut down into themselves, and they were trying to protect themselves. So there was a lot of despair and anger. There was no empathy. And it was very disturbing. And I left very shaken and shocked that some people trying to find a place to sleep, and that's basically what the women's quarters looked like. So I was very shaken afterwards. But what was very interesting to me was Johnson's reaction. Because he wasn't upset, he was angry. And he wasn't angry with the people who had allowed this to happen, or the South Africans who had attacked his people, or the South African government who wasn't helping. He was angry with the refugees. And he kept saying in this voice of total contempt, he said, "Oh, it's pathetic. It's pathetic." And it took me a while to figure out why he felt that way. And it was a defensive mechanism. He was trying to say, "I am not like that. I would not be like that in those circumstances. That is not me." And I think that is our instinctive reaction in that kind of situation, is to try and disassociate, to try and get on with our own selfishness and our own personal lives. And that's where I think fiction is so powerful. But in this case, it was too powerful. It became overwhelming. I couldn't possibly write about this. It would have taken over the entire book. So what I did was I made it personal. And that's what fiction does. You find one personal story to tell it. And the heroine Zinzi has a boyfriend who's a DRC refugee. And I try to put all this baggage on him, and I try to bring through this very affecting, crazy story to a certain extent in a different way through him, using a fictional construct to get at something I found overwhelming. And I'm going to come back. There's a little epilogue to the story. I'll come back to that in a second. So sometimes reality is overwhelming. Sometimes fiction can kick back into reality. Reality King's back, which can be very cool. And one of the things I find most exciting as a writer is when people respond to my work and they play with it in their own way. And it's really exciting. I love getting fan fiction. I love getting fan art. And this is actually official Moxieland stencil. It was made by the cover designer, and it was released in the back of the US edition. And this guy emailed me and said, oh, well, I've just made it into a mod for Halo, which was awesome. I was so excited about that. This is some great fan art of some of the characters in Moxieland by William Oak. This is one of the characters in Zoo City, drawn by Werner Diedrichs. It's the Afghan warlord with his penguin and the bulletproof vest. And this is John O'Cohen, and I particularly love this illustration. And that's very cool. It's very cool to have other people play in your universe. It's really exciting, it's inspiring, it's awesome. But sometimes you actually need to affect something in the real world as well, even if it's on a really small scale, and it was really important to me that I tried to do that. So the sloth on Zinzi's back. A friend of mine made me a sloth scarf when I went to the Arthur C. Clarke Awards, and I actually wore it to the awards, and it was so cool that lots of other people started asking for it, and I was like, well, I don't think we should just sell them, I think we should try and do something with it. So we auctioned off the five extra sloth scarves, the only ones in the world, and we raised money for an amazing organization called Kalisa, which perfect for Zoo City, because Zoo City is about crime and redemption. It's an organization that works with offenders and ex-offenders to try and change their lives and rehabilitate them. And whereas the normal reoffense rate in South Africa is something like 80%, you know, if you've committed one crime, it is 80% likely that you will commit another. People who've been through Kalisa, it drops to 14%. So they're doing really amazing work. So we raised about 1,000 New Zealand dollars for them through this. With Moxieland, we got the Moxie toy from the cover. We got a women's group, which we set up especially to make toys and sell them. We raised about 18,000 rand divided by 5. Anyone? I'll let you work that out. And then coming back to the refugees and the Central Methodist Church, I really wanted to try and do something with that. The Central Methodist Church is a bit complicated, so I found another refugee organization. And I found 5 different illustrators and artists in Cape Town, and they decorated vinyl toy bears, which were about this big. And we auctioned them off for charity. And what was, again, amazing about this was that people customized these any way they wanted to, as long as it was somehow inspired by the novel. And again, it was so amazing to see what people came up with, and it was so inspiring and cool. And we raised, again, I think 18,000 rand, and it was for an organization called the Suitcase Project. And this, again, was just so apt, and this is all about the power of story. So, art toys inspired by a novel for a charity organization that helps refugee children, and they're very little. You know, they might come through to South Africa on their own from like places like the DRC at 5 years old, and they arrive in this strange city, and they don't know where they are or what's going on or what to do. There's no one to look after them, and they suffered these terrible traumas along the way, but they're 5, and they can't talk about it. So this woman, Glynis Clackerty, got them to decorate a suitcase to try and tell their stories, and that's how she got it out of them. So that's where, you know, the money went. And that's, again, the power of story and being able to find a way to tell your stories. So I think the closing thought that I want to leave you guys with is that the world is made flexible through story, and that we should be telling as many stories as we can. It's the way we talk to ourselves in our own heads, the story we tell ourselves about our lives. It's the way we communicate to other people. And I think we absolutely have to be inspired by the real world as much as possible, because the real world is insane and inspiring and infuriating and just incredible. And I think we need to tell those stories in whatever way we can. Thank you.